The young man stirred to life beneath the sprawling branches of an oak tree, the rough bark scraping his back as he sat up. He blinked against the dense darkness, his breath curling in the cold night air. Around him stretched an unfamiliar world, a wide city street, framed by looming buildings that seemed to bend toward him like silent sentinels. Something was wrong. He couldn't place why or how he got there, but the air felt heavy and charged, as though every particle carried an unseen weight. He called into the silence, his voice echoing weakly before fading into nothingness. There was no reply. The city before him seemed utterly abandoned, not a single light in the windows or sound in the distance. His footsteps, cautious and deliberate, were the only breaks in the stillness. He scanned the area, his eyes trailing over empty cars, left idle, doors ajar. Traffic lights blinked in broken mechanical loops, red, green, yellow, like they were signaling to no one. Each building he passed had windows that stared down at him, like dead, unblinking eyes. Somewhere behind his ribs, a clawing unease began to stir, an almost primal sensation, the kind of fear that pushes its way into the mind when there is something unseen but very present. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to shake it off, but he couldn't. With every step forward, he felt more certain he wasn't alone. He turned a corner and stopped abruptly. A playground sat in the middle of the vast emptiness, an eerie splash of color against the monotony of the gray, lifeless streets. The swings swayed gently, though there was no wind. His gaze lingered on them, his mind cycling through explanations that made no sense. Maybe it was residual momentum, he thought. Maybe he didn't want to know. The night sky, starless and black like the void, seemed to press down upon his shoulders. The shadows in the alleys stretched longer than they should have, their edges too sharp, too deliberate. He quickened his pace, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. He spun around more than once, his breath catching as he convinced himself he'd see someone, or something, lurking just on the edge of his vision. There was nothing. Always nothing. He murmured reassurances to himself aloud, the sound of his voice oddly comforting in the oppressive quiet. He repeated the logic like a mantra. There's no one here. It's in my head. It's all a mistake, a dream, a glitch. But the back of his neck prickled. He dared not look behind him, and instead walked faster, his footsteps hurried, yet muted against the asphalt. He stumbled upon a cafe with its door left ajar. The glass windows revealed rows of chairs toppled over as if people had left in a panic. The faint smell of coffee beans somehow still lingered. He stepped inside, his breathing shaky. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, convinced something would move. The stillness inside was unbearable. He grabbed a mug from a table. The ceramic felt cold to the touch, as though it had been abandoned for hours, maybe days. As he left the cafe, an old phone booth caught his eye, standing defiant, despite the years of neglect. His heart lunged with hope. Perhaps it worked. He shoved himself into the booth, picked up the receiver, and pressed his ear against it. But the line was silent. Just as he was about to hang up, a faint breath, human, unmistakable, whispered across the line. He froze. He didn't disconnect. Neither did the sound. He dropped the receiver and stumbled out of the booth, his pulse racing as though it wanted to burst free of his veins. He clutched at his chest, struggling to breathe, his eyes darting wildly across the street, Something was out there. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. It didn't just watch. It waited. Another street. Another block. The dark brick facades began to resemble jagged teeth in the dim light, as if the city itself had turned hostile. A faint tapping reached his ears, a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like footsteps matching his own tempo, but coming from nowhere. He stopped walking. The sound stopped too. He moved again, and it resumed. His throat tightened. He glanced down at his shadow. It stretched obediently in the glow of a flickering street lamp. But it wasn't just his shadow. Another silhouette lingered, longer, taller, its shape wrong and warped. His stomach churned with fear, and he staggered back, his shadow snapping back to just one as he looked around wildly. There was no one else there. By now, his breathing was erratic. He fought the urge to run, knowing it would only make things worse. He tried to focus ahead, to find an end to this maze of streets, but there was no recognizable landmark. Every turn led back to more of the same abandoned, empty city. He screamed at the top of his lungs into the emptiness. It was defiance, frustration, and fear wrapped into one, but it only made the silence that followed deeper. He broke into a sprint, his feet pounding against the pavement as he ran without direction. Street after street blurred together in his panic, the dark shapes of buildings scraping at the edges of his vision. A single thought pulsed in his mind, a repetitive drumbeat forcing his legs to keep moving. If you stop, it will catch you. It has always been there. At last, his legs gave out, and he collapsed in the middle of a crossroads. His chest burned with every gulp of air, his limbs feeling like wax melting under heat. He rolled onto his back and stared up. The sky had changed, or maybe it hadn't. It still looked like nothingness, more of an absence than a presence. The quiet was deafening, as if every sound had been sucked from the world. Something moved at the corner of his vision, just on the edge. A figure, featureless and black as the vacuum above, stepped into the dim streetlight. Its shape was close enough to resemble human, but just shy of making sense. It didn't walk. It glided closer, its head tilting in an unnatural jerking motion, as if it were studying him. He wanted to scream, but his voice had left him. It always has, something whispered inside his own head. The man pushed himself up, trembling, determined to flee again, but he faltered. In every direction he turned, more figures emerged from the shadows, their forms bending and flickering like corrupted signals. They surrounded him, not moving closer, just standing, watching. The world seemed to fold in on itself, the heavy air closing in, squeezing him like a vice. He shut his eyes, willing it all to vanish, but when he opened them again, they were closer. In a voice not his own, his mind echoed one final thought. You were never alone.